Hey guys, you're probably listening to this because you missed a day of class, or because you wanted to go over it again. So I'm going to briefly recap what we did on day one. This is minus the activities and some of like the more nitpicky stuff that we did, but you'll still get an overview of the notes that actually are important. So first things first, we need to talk about research methods. You know how we're the scientific study of behavior and mental processes of humans and other animals? Well, it's time to talk about the scientific studies portion so that we can spend the rest of the year talking about the mental processes and the behaviors for most of it, at least. So, the first thing you need to know is we do have some goals in scientific research, and we're going to start with scientific research. And then we're going to move into ethics and how to not be a terrible person. And we'll finish off with statistics and how to actually analyze all of the data that we get. So we'll talk about our goals first. There are pretty standard goals across the board, and our example is going to be how well girls and boys participate in class, and how well they do on participation grades in class. So the first goal that we have in psychology is that we want to measure and describe. We need a way to develop measurement techniques that will allow us to describe the behaviors we're seeing. It's really hard to measure participation between boys and girls without defining what participation should look like. Whether it's raising your hand, commenting in the chat, do you have a distinction between whether you're asking a question or you're answering a question or you're going to the bathroom? So it just depends. We have to be really specific when we do this. So for our sake, we're going to say it's the number of times you raise your hand in class. The second thing we want to do is you want to understand and predict. So we want to figure out why something is happening, pretty much. For the most part, this involves a hypothesis, which you've probably heard about 1,000 times. And this is just a statement about the relationship between two or more factors or variables. Variables, of course, are our measurable factors or conditions that we're interested in studying. So in our example, our variables are gender and participation. So specifically, participation is hand raising. So your hypothesis or prediction that comes from that is girls are more likely to raise their hands than boys are. The last thing we want to do is apply and control. Remember, the whole goal of psychology is to use what we're learning for helping people. So we want to use what we've learned to solve a problem, or at least understand one enough that we can make some sort of suggestion. So if we're interested in participation, maybe we generally know from other studies that students who participate more do better on tests. So if we figure out that girls are participating more than boys, we can start taking steps towards getting boys to participate more, and then thus, excelling in the course. That's just a general idea. We're going to talk about all of these things in a lot more specifics. And we're going to start by talking about some keywords that you need to know that'll actually help you out. So, the first keyword you need to know is generalize. The word generalize, or you can call it generalizable, basically means can we apply it to everyone? So, whatever our study is, you're obviously not going to study every single person in the world, but you want to study a subset of people so that you can apply it to the rest of people. And the only way you can generalize information is really if you pay attention to the subjects or the sample of the group. So first, we need to talk about the population. That goes along with being generalized. The population is everyone in whatever group that we want to study. So it's the group we're trying to generalize it to. So if our population is high school students, maybe we study just North Brunswick kids. If our population is females age 18 to 25, maybe we study just a subset of females age 18 to 25. Population is everybody, okay? Samples are then subsets of those groups, and that's the group you're actually going to be studying, or they're going to participate in your experiment or take your survey or whatever it is. There are two kinds of samples that you need to make sure that we can generalize it back to everybody in the population. The first is a random sample. A random sample is basically something that says every single person in the population has an equal chance of being chosen to be in the study. So maybe you're putting everyone's name in a hat and you're randomly drawing them out, and bam, you have a random sample. If we're studying our population of North Brunswick students, I would take all 1,900 of your names, put them into a hat, and then draw out 100, and those 100 kids are now in my study. That is a random sample. The more random your sample is, the more legitimate your research will be, because then you can apply it to the whole group and you can reduce some biases and stuff we'll talk about later. Representative sample, this basically means that your sample should look like the whole group. So if we're studying NBTHS, we don't just want to have a group of Asian and white students, for example, or we don't want to have just a group of black students because we can't apply those back to the entire group. We also want to make sure that they are this representative of the age distribution. So we don't just want seniors, we don't just want freshmen, we don't just want boys. You need to make sure that your sample looks like the population itself. And that little pie chart on the bottom is kind of the representation we have for it. So as you can see, like we want about half the people to come from the red and blue groups, but we only want one person from the gray group because the gray group makes up a smaller subset of the population. If you can't make it look like your population, chances are you're not going to be able to generalize it back to them. Okay. Continuing on other stuff we're looking for in studies, this these three are really, really important. The first is validity. So, is it valid? That means, does our experiment test what it's supposed to test? Are we trying to measure what we're supposed to measure? Measuring participation by raising your hand is pretty good. That seems to measure participation pretty well. I mean, with some errors in the way, of course. Um, it's not valid if I were to say your Unit 1 test is actually going to be about astronomy. I haven't taught you astronomy. I'm not measuring what you know about Unit 1 of psychology. I'm measuring what you know about astronomy instead. And that's not valid, meaning you're not actually testing what I'm supposed to be testing. Reliability. So this is, can we do the test again and get the same results? So if I were to give each one of you the astronomy test and say it's the Unit 1 test, it's not valid, but it might be reliable. Maybe none of you guys know anything about astronomy, in which case you're going to fail this test, but you're all going to fail it together. That's a reliable test, even though it's not valid. It wouldn't be valid if I gave the same Unit 1 test next year and all of my kids failed it, whereas you guys aced it, and the year before that did okay on it. That's not a reliable test. You're not getting the same results every time you give it. Okay. And then replicability is similar to reliability in that it's, can we do the experiment again in general? Like, can we physically repeat your study? So if your study has really confusing procedures or instructions, we're probably not going to be able to do it again. You need to make sure that your instructions are clear and easy to follow so that we can do the study again later on. When you're ready to actually do your study, we have some, theory building terms you need to know. We've talked about a hypothesis before many, many times in your life, probably, and already in this lecture. But of course, your hypothesis is just an educated guess in the most simplest of terms. We make our hypothesis based on facts. This is a statement about the relationship between two things, and that's where we go and run with it. We don't just make them up out of nowhere, we do base them in something else. Variables, these are the measurable factors, like I mentioned before, whether they're events or characteristics or behaviors. Anything we can measure and control or observe in a study is a variable. And then, of course, your theory. A theory is just a bunch of connected ideas that explain a set of observations. So we have a bunch of concepts in place, and then we build a theory from there. So, for example, let's say we're observing animal relationships, like mating preferences, and we're noticing things like aggression, sexual behavior, and jealousy. We already know things like natural selection and survival of the fittest or reproductive fitness. So maybe we put all of this together and call it our evolutionary theory. And this can now help us understand behavior that is along the same lines. So if we're watching two alpha male lions fight over a female lion, and the female lion chooses the winner, that's probably going to go along with the reproductive fitness aspect because she's choosing the more physically fit mate. Theories tend to be helpful because they can really set up space for future research and new ideas. But the big thing to know about a theory is that it has to be testable. We have to be able to test it. So in our theory, maybe we'd set up a study to study one or two hypotheses instead of like the entire theory, which would be super overwhelming. And you can focus on those variables. And if you get it right, you can look at the theory and make it stronger and stronger. And if it's wrong, you can go back and revisit or discard the theory altogether, whatever you need to do at that point. Um, the variables you need to know, these are like the major ones to know, of course. Your homework assignment, that's replacing the correlational assignment you were supposed to have, which we wouldn't even have got to today anyway, is going to be on independent and dependent variables. So please listen closely. So the independent variable is the variable we manipulate or change in an experiment to produce some sort of effect. So in the example on the screen, your independent variable is the amount of water you give the plant. So usually you measure that, like let's say with water, you'll measure in like milliliters, for example. The dependent variable is the variable or outcome that changes based on the independent variable. So if we're making changes to the independent variable, we expect to see the results in our dependent variable. So if you look at the picture, you see maybe the number of leaves that it has, maybe the status of whether it's alive or dead, maybe how big the plant has grown. Those kinds of things would be our dependent variable. What is actually changing based on the independent variable? It's almost like it's dependent on the independent variable. Crazy. Um, and then finally, operational definitions. These are specific guidelines for how we measure variables. You need to be super specific. So if someone tries to replicate your study, they can with all of the exact same things you did, so they can prove that it was right or wrong. There are some things that are super easy to operationalize, which is the word for operational definitions. So the amount of water is very easy to operationalize. You either use 500 milliliters or 100 or 1,000. Um, whatever. Um, there are some things that are super vague. So, like happiness is really hard to operationalize or clarify what it means. So, you have to be really, really specific, or else people won't be able to get the same results you did and prove that your theory is or your experiment is accurate. And then thus your theory is good. The final thing we talked about on day one is research designs. So I'm going to go over what these various things are good for, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit. We'll go through each one kind of in depth, but we'll generally talk about what each one is good for. So the first is an experiment. So an experiment is great for establishing cause and effect. And in fact, it's the only one that can establish cause and effect because you're manipulating variables, you're seeing direct results, and all of that kind of fun stuff. So that's really what it's like known for. If you're looking for cause and effect, like A causes B, experiments your go-to. Surveys are really good for studying a ton of people really quickly. And you can identify that there's a relationship between two variables. So if we're looking at sleep and grades, maybe I send out a survey that's asking you how many hours you sleep a night, and I'm also asking you what your grades are. Now I see that there's a relationship between the number of hours you sleep and how well you do in class. So I can actually set up an experiment to prove whether better sleep causes um, better grades, or maybe better grades cause you to stress out less so you sleep more. So we don't know which direction it goes. We just know that there's a relationship there from the survey. And you can prove that relationship with an experiment later. Naturalistic observation, these are good for seeing realistic situations and interactions that you can't really see in a lab setting. Naturalistic, obviously, get the idea of the word natural. We'll talk about this one a little bit later, but you can really see what is going on in the real world with very minimal interference. A cross-sectional study, this is good for looking at differences in different generations of people at one time. So whether it's you, me, your mom, and your grandpa, those are different generations of people, and we can study them all at the same time and get an idea of what different generations go through and are feeling and are doing and things like that. The longitudinal study is good for tracking changes over time because that can tell us about how a specific group of people change from pretty much birth to death or however long your study goes. And then finally, a case study. A case study is good for studying specific situations in depth that may be unethical to study otherwise. We'll talk about various case studies of people like Phineas Gage, who had a railroad spike go through his brain, and it severed his frontal lobe. And he lived, and he was actually fine. But we can study him in depth because it's something that happened to him. We can't necessarily go around shoving railroad spikes through people's brains so that we can study what it might be like, because we'll probably kill a lot of people if we do that. So we're not going to do it. But that's what a case study is for. So when something happens to someone else, we can study them in depth and learn a lot from them without having to repeat that kind of thing to someone else and hurt other people. And this is where we left off on day one. So hopefully you're all caught up. And if you have any questions, you know you can ask. I am always here. Good luck and goodbye.